Elowen Nightingale traced the crack in the porcelain teacup, a fine, spidery line that mirrored the fractures in her own life. Outside the orphanage window, a relentless autumn rain wept down the glass, turning the world into a gray, watery blur. The chill of the day had seeped through the stone walls of St. Marguerite's Home for Children, a dampness that clung to the threadbare blankets and settled deep in the bones. It was the chill of poverty, of dwindling hope. For years, she had been the bedrock of this place, the eldest orphan who had stayed on to become its caretaker, its mother in all but name. But bedrock could be worn down by a constant dripping despair. The last of their patrons had passed. The larders were nearly bare, and the landlord, a man with a heart as cold as the coins he coveted, had given them until month's end. Desperation was a bitter tea she had been forced to drink every morning, and its taste was now a permanent stain upon her soul. She was resigned to her fate, a life of thankless sacrifice, but the thought of the children, their small, trusting faces turned up to hers, being cast out into the unforgiving streets, was a torment beyond endurance. Miles away, in a world of gilded ceilings and polished marble, Crown Prince Leander Ravencrest felt a different kind of chill. It was the cold of isolation, a frost that had encased his heart since the Great Northern War. He wore his title like a suit of armor, heavy and suffocating, deflecting the simpering courtiers and the ambitious nobles who saw him not as a man, but as a stepping stone to power. They whispered of his silence, his severity, calling him the Winter Prince, never understanding that the cold they perceived was the ghost of burning villages and the screams of fallen comrades. His father, the king, saw only his duty, to marry the vapid and beautiful Lady Evangeline Ashworth, secure the line of succession, and present a flawless, smiling facade to the world. The arrangement was a cage, and Leander felt its bars pressing in on him. He yearned for something true, for a moment of peace away from the masks and the lies, for someone who might see the man beneath the crown, the broken soldier beneath the prince. This yearning hardened into a desperate, unconventional plan, a flight from his own life, a search for an honest soul in the quiet corners of his kingdom. The inciting incident arrived not with a royal trumpet, but with the quiet, deliberate knock of a solicitor on the orphanage door. The man, clad in severe black, represented an anonymous benefactor. He spoke of a client, a wealthy but reclusive gentleman living in a remote northern estate. This gentleman, he explained, was a man of profound silence and solitude, scarred by life and seeking no companionship in the traditional sense. He required a wife, but not a lover or a companion. He required a chatelaine, a woman of good character and quiet disposition to manage his household in exchange for a lifetime of security. The most staggering part of the proposition was the dowry, a sum so immense it would not only save St. Marguerite's, but would ensure its flourishing for decades to come. The rule was simple and absolute. She was to be his wife in name only, to expect no affection, no conversation, and to never, under any circumstances, intrude upon his private grief. She would be a ghost in his house, and in return, the children she loved would be safe. It was a devil's bargain cloaked in charity, a marriage to a silent outcast. For Elowen, who had long ago abandoned any dreams of love for herself, it was the only answer to her prayers. She accepted, her heart a stone of resignation in her chest, never knowing she was agreeing to marry the Crown Prince of Ethoria in disguise. Elowen's journey north was a passage from one world to another. The carriage, though unmarked, was sprung with a surprising comfort that felt alien against her simple wool dress. She watched the cobbled streets of the city give way to rolling farmland, which in turn yielded to the dense, brooding expanse of the northern woods. The air grew crisper, scented with pine and damp earth. For 3 days she traveled in a state of quiet numbness, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and resolve. She clutched a small, worn book of fables, the only personal possession she had brought with her, its familiar weight a small anchor in the vast sea of uncertainty. The solicitor had been explicit. Her husband, a man known only as Finn, had suffered greatly. He was not to be disturbed. He would take his meals alone. He would occupy the west wing of Thornfield Manor, and she, the east. Their paths were not meant to cross. She was to be the mistress of a house whose master was a shadow. It was a strange, hollow existence she was stepping into, but every jolt of the carriage wheels was a reminder of the gold that was, at that very moment, filling the coffers of St. Marguerite's. For that, she could endure anything. She could become a ghost. Thornfield Manor emerged from the mist-shrouded trees not as a grand, imposing structure, but as a place of melancholy beauty. It was built of dark, weathered stone, covered in a thick mantle of ivy that softened its severe lines. It spoke not of neglect, but of a long and quiet slumber. A woman with hair as white as snow and a posture as straight as a soldier's stood waiting on the steps. Her name was Mrs. Thornwick, the housekeeper, and her eyes, a pale and knowing blue, seemed to assess Aloan in a single, sweeping glance. There was no warmth in her greeting, only a crisp, professional courtesy. "Welcome to Thornfield, my lady," she said, the title feeling foreign and absurd on Eloan's tongue. The interior of the manor was a place of shadows and dust motes, dancing in the thin shafts of afternoon light. Furniture lay shrouded in white cloths, portraits on the walls were turned to face the plaster, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper. It was a house holding its breath. Mrs. Thornwick led her to the east wing, a suite of rooms that were surprisingly clean and aired, a small island of life in the dormant house. "Master Finn values his privacy above all else," the housekeeper stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your duties will be to oversee the staff and the accounts. You will want for nothing, so long as you remember the arrangement." From her window, Eloan first saw him. He was in the walled garden at the back of the manor, a place that had been allowed to grow wild and beautiful in its untamed state. He stood with his back to her, a tall figure dressed in the simple, dark garb of a commoner. His hair was the color of midnight, and it fell just over the collar of his tunic. He moved with a strange, contained grace, yet there was a stiffness in his posture, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of a constant underlying pain. He leaned heavily on a walking stick as he bent to examine a cluster of late-blooming roses, their crimson petals a stark contrast to the encroaching gray of the season. He did not speak, did not make a sound, but she felt the weight of his silence from across the manicured lawn. He was the enigma at the heart of her new life, the silent outcast she had married. She felt a pang of pity for him, a man so wounded he had chosen to wall himself off from the world. It was a feeling she quickly suppressed. Pity was an emotion, and emotions had no place in this transaction. She was here to be a manager, a caretaker of stone and wood, not of a broken heart. The first weeks at Thornfield Manor passed in a silent, monotonous rhythm. Aloan established a routine, her practical nature a balm against the house's oppressive quiet. She worked with Mrs. Thornwick and the two skittish maids to bring the manor back to a state of quiet order. She had the dust cloths removed, the furniture polished, and the windows washed until they gleamed. She found the ledgers in the study and, with a sharp mind that had long been underutilized, began to untangle the estate's finances, discovering they were surprisingly robust. She learned the geography of her gilded cage, the sprawling library with its thousands of leather-bound books, the grand ballroom where the chandeliers remained dark and cold, the kitchens that produced meals for a master she never saw. Finn remained a phantom. She would hear his uneven footsteps in the hall of the West Wing late at night or catch a glimpse of him walking the misty grounds at dawn. They were two planets in separate orbits, held together by a contract they never discussed. Yet, she began to notice inconsistencies. Once, she found a book left open in the library, a complex text on military strategy, with notes scribbled in the margins in a hand that was surprisingly elegant and educated. Another time, she heard the faint melancholic notes of a pianoforte drifting from the West Wing, a melody of such profound sadness that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. This silent, common man was more than he appeared. He was a collection of contradictions she was forbidden to solve. From his own solitary world, Leander watched her. He had expected a woman cowed by circumstance, perhaps resentful, perhaps greedy. He had not expected Ilowen. He observed her from the shadows of the West Wing corridor or through the leaded glass of his study window. He saw the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the way she treated the maids with a kindness that was born of shared experience, not noblesse oblige. He watched her bring his house, his sanctuary, back to life not with dramatic changes, but with a gentle, persistent care. She did not pry, she did not complain. She simply existed within the boundaries he had set, and yet her very presence began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a quiet light in the gloom. He saw the weariness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the deep-seated sadness that she masked with dutiful efficiency. He had purchased her presence to solve a problem of his own, to create a shield against his father's demands and a space to heal his own fractured soul. He had intended for her to be a piece on his chessboard, a strategic move. But watching her move through the lonely halls of his self-imposed exile, he felt an unsettling and unfamiliar stirring of conscience. She was not a piece in a game. She was a woman who had sacrificed her own life for the sake of others, and he had taken what little she had left. The first true crack in the wall between them came during a storm. It was a violent, raging tempest that threw itself against the manor, rattling the windows and howling down the chimneys like a vengeful spirit. Eowyn had always been unnerved by storms, but she sat in her parlor, forcing herself to focus on her mending, the needle a small, sharp point of control in the chaos. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the wind and rain, a sound that was not of the storm. It was a human cry, a raw, agonized shout that seemed torn from the very depths of a nightmare. It came from the West Wing. For a moment she froze, the solicitor's warnings echoing in her mind. Do not disturb him. Do not intrude. But the sound came again, followed by a violent crash, and her compassion, the very instinct that had defined her entire life, overwhelmed her caution. She grabbed a candelabra, its small flames flickering wildly, and ran from her rooms, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pushed open the heavy oak door that separated the two wings, a boundary she had never before crossed, and stepped into the darkness of his world. She found him in his bedchamber. A heavy table lay overturned, a pitcher of water shattered on the floorboards. Finn was thrashing in his bed, entangled in the sheets, his face pale and slick with sweat in the flickering candlelight. His eyes were closed, but he was not asleep. He was trapped in a memory, a prisoner of some unseen horror. No. The northern gate. Fall back, he gasped, his voice raspy with a terror that was chillingly real. He spoke of fire and steel, of betrayal and defeat. These were not the ramblings of a simple man. They were the ghosts of a battlefield. Without thinking, Eloan set the candelabra on a nearby chest and moved to his side. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it on his forehead. It was burning with fever. "Hush," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "You are safe. It is only a dream. The storm is passing." She did not know if he could hear her, but she continued to speak, her words a gentle litany against the terrors of his mind. She dipped a cloth in the remaining water from the pitcher and bathed his face, her movements calm and sure. She spoke of the quiet garden, of the books in the library, of anything that was peaceful and real. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to still. The frantic thrashing subsided, and the harsh, guttural cries softened into ragged breaths. His eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, clouded with the lingering smoke of his nightmare. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and raw vulnerability. In that instant, the formidable wall of his silence crumbled, and she saw not an outcast, but a man drowning in a pain so profound it had stolen his voice. He did not pull away from her touch. Instead, a shudder ran through him, and he seemed to lean into the cool comfort of her hand. He said nothing, but his eyes, now clear, held hers. They were the eyes of a man who had not known a gentle touch in a very long time. Eloan felt a powerful, protective surge, an instinct to shield him from the demons that haunted him. She had broken the most important rule of their arrangement, but as she looked at the broken man before her, she knew she could not have done otherwise. She stayed with him, sitting in a chair beside the bed, until his breathing evened out into a true and peaceful sleep. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gray, she slipped away as silently as she had come, leaving him to wake alone. The next day, the silence in the manor was different. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken things. Eloan expected a reprimand, perhaps a cold dismissal from Mrs. Thornwick, a reinforcement of the rules she had so flagrantly violated. But none came. Instead, when she went down for her solitary breakfast, she found a single, perfect crimson rose laid beside her plate. There was no note, no explanation, but she knew. It was a message, a silent acknowledgement. Later that day, as she worked on the accounts in the library, she felt a presence. She looked up to see Finn standing in the doorway. He did not enter, but simply stood there, his walking stick in hand, watching her. He inclined his head in a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning and walking away. The distance between them remained, but the nature of it had changed. It was no longer a chasm of indifference, but a bridge of shared, silent understanding. A new routine began to form, tentative and fragile. He started taking his evening meal not in his wing, but in the main dining hall, at the far end of the long, polished table. They ate in silence, the cavernous room amplifying the sounds of cutlery on china. Yet, it was a shared silence, a communion that needed no words. He would leave books for her on the library table, books of poetry and philosophy, and she would find them and read them, feeling as though they were having a conversation across the pages. Leander found himself drawn to her presence. Her act of compassion during his night terror had breached a defense he had spent years constructing. For the first time since the war, someone had seen his weakness, his horror, and had not recoiled or tried to use it against him. Instead, she had offered simple, uncomplicated kindness. He had chosen her for her quiet nature, for what he perceived as a lack of ambition that would make her a safe and manageable part of his deception. He had been a fool. Her quietness was not emptiness. It was a reservoir of immense strength. He began to test the boundaries of their silent world. One afternoon, while she was arranging flowers in the main hall, he came down from his wing and, without a word, took a vase from her and placed it on a high mantelpiece she could not reach. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second, and a jolt, warm and startling, passed between them. He saw the faint blush that rose on her cheeks and the surprise in her eyes, and he felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead within him, a simple, human connection. He started writing notes, leaving them for her between the pages of books. They were not personal, not at first. They were observations, quotes from the texts, questions about a particular passage. She would reply in her neat, clear script, her answers always insightful and intelligent. Their minds were meeting, and with each exchange, he felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw. The turning point came one cool evening in the library. Elawan was perched on a ladder, reaching for a book on a high shelf, when her foot slipped. She cried out as she lost her balance, bracing for the hard impact of the floor. But the impact never came. Instead, strong arms encircled her, breaking her fall and holding her securely against a firm chest. She looked up into Finn's face, so close to her own that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark, troubled eyes. He held her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his grip protective, his expression unreadable. "Be careful," he said. The word was a rough, gravelly whisper, the first he had ever spoken to her. It was as if the sound had been pulled from a deep, unused well. The shock of hearing his voice rendered her speechless. He gently set her back on her feet, his hands lingering on her arms for a second before he released her. He looked as surprised as she felt. A dark flush crept up his neck, and he turned away abruptly, grabbing his cane and leaving the library without another word, his uneven footsteps echoing in the hall. Elowen stood frozen, her heart racing. The single word he had spoken was a key turning in a lock, opening a door to 1,000 new questions. The silence had been broken, and she knew, with a dizzying certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, the change was palpable. Finn, she still thought of him by that name, began to speak, though his words were sparse and carefully chosen. He would join her for walks in the wild garden, pointing out different plants and naming them in that low, rough voice of his. He told her he had learned botany from a field medic during the war. He spoke of the stars, naming the constellations on a clear night. He never spoke of his past, of the source of his nightmares, or of the reasons for his exile. But he shared small pieces of himself, fragments of knowledge and quiet observations. Elawan, in turn, found herself opening up to him. She told him about St. Marguerite's, about the children, about her fears and her reasons for accepting the strange marriage proposal. She spoke of her simple, unfulfilled dream of one day having a small cottage with a garden of her own. He would listen intently, his dark eyes fixed on her, his silence no longer a barrier, but an invitation. She was falling in love with this quiet, wounded man. It was a foolish, dangerous thing to do, a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of their contract. She knew it could only lead to heartache, for he was a man defined by his secrets, but her heart no longer listened to the cautious warnings of her mind. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a caretaker or a sacrifice, but as Elowen. For Leander, every conversation was a revelation and a torment. He was falling in love with his wife, the woman he had deceived from the very beginning. Her goodness, her intelligence, her resilience, it was all genuine. He had come to Thornfield seeking an escape from the lies of the court, only to build a new, more personal lie of his own. The name Finn felt like a betrayal on his tongue. The simple clothes he wore felt like a costume. He had wanted someone to see the man, not the prince, but he had not anticipated that he would come to care so deeply for that person's opinion. How could he ever tell her the truth? How could he explain that their quiet life was a fiction he had constructed? That the very foundation of their burgeoning trust was a lie? He knew he had to, but the fear of seeing the warmth in her eyes turn to cold contempt held him captive. He told himself he would find the right time, the right words, but the perfect moment never seemed to arrive. He was caught in his own trap, and with every passing day as their connection deepened, the walls of that trap closed in tighter around him. The illusion of their secluded peace was shattered by the thunder of hoofbeats and the arrival of a royal carriage. It bore the crest of the hawk, the sigil of Lord Lucian Blackthorne, the king's most ambitious and ruthless adviser. Alawan was in the garden when it arrived, and she watched with a sense of dread as a tall, imperious man with cold, calculating eyes stepped onto the gravel drive. He surveyed the manor with a look of undisguised disdain. Mrs. Thornwick intercepted him at the door, her face a stony mask, but Lucian Blackthorne pushed past her with an arrogant wave of his hand. "I am here to see the master of this hovel. Fetch him." The commotion brought Finn out from the west wing, his face dark as a thundercloud. He moved to stand in front of Alawan, a protective gesture that was pure instinct. The moment Lord Lucian Blackthorne saw him, his disdainful expression morphed into one of triumphant cruelty. He swept into a low, mocking bow. "Your Highness," he said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "We have been so very worried about you. The king has been most concerned to find you hiding away in this dreary place, and with a commoner playing at being your wife. A truly pathetic little farce." The world tilted on its axis. Elowen stared, her mind refusing to process the words. "Your Highness." The title echoed in the sudden ringing silence. She looked from Lucian Blackthorne's sneering face to Finn's. No, Leander's, impassive one. The pieces of the puzzle, the inconsistencies she had so carefully set aside, now slammed into place with brutal clarity. The educated speech, the knowledge of military strategy, the innate authority in his posture, the melancholy music. He was not Finn, the wounded outcast. He was Prince Leander Ravencrest, the Winter Prince, heir to the throne of Athoria. And she was his dupe, the centerpiece of his elaborate deception. A wave of cold fury followed by a sickening tide of humiliation washed over her. Every kind word, every shared silence, every tentative touch was cast in a new, hideous light. It was all a lie. She had been bought and paid for, a pawn in a royal game she hadn't even known she was playing. The pity she had felt for him curdled into a bitter poison in her veins. He was not a broken man she had helped to heal. He was a powerful prince who had used her, who had observed her like an insect under glass. "Get out of my house," Leander said, his voice low and dangerous, his focus entirely on Lucian Blackthorne. He had dropped the persona of Finn completely. The quiet, hesitant man was gone, replaced by a prince radiating cold, lethal authority. Lucian Blackthorne simply laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your house? This is the king's land, and you are his wayward son. Your little holiday is over. His Majesty has commanded your return to the capital. Your wedding to Lady Evangeline Ashworth is to be announced at the harvest ball. You will set this peasant aside and do your duty." He cast a deliberately insulting glance at Elowen. "Unless, of course, you wish for the entire court to learn how the Crown Prince of Athoria sullied his bloodline by secretly marrying a nameless orphan. A scandal like that could be quite destabilizing. It might even lead some to question your fitness to rule. The threat was clear. Lucian Blackthorn had found the prince's weakness, the one secret that could be used to ruin him. He intended to use Elowin as a weapon to clear his own path to power. After Lucian Blackthorn had gone, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air, a suffocating silence descended upon them once more. But this was not the comfortable, shared silence of before. It was a chasm of betrayal. Elowin finally turned to face Leander, her body trembling with a rage she had never known she possessed. "Your Highness," she spat, the title a curse. "Was it amusing? Watching the poor, desperate orphan fall for your little masquerade?" Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were dry and hard. "You let me tend to you. You let me believe you were, like me, broken, alone. Was any of it real? Or was I just a part of the scenery in your pastoral escape?" Leander reached for her, his face etched with a pain that, for once, she did not believe. "Elowin, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" She shot back, stepping away from his touch as if it were fire. "Explain how you used my desperation? How you bought yourself a wife to hide behind while you shirked your duties? I thought I had made a bargain to save my family. I did not realize I was selling myself into a lie." She backed away, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "I wish I had never laid eyes on you. I wish I had taken my children and starved in the streets. It would have been a more honest fate than this." She turned and fled to her rooms, the sound of her own heartbroken sobs chasing her down the empty hall. Leander stood alone in the hall, the force of her words striking him harder than any physical blow. He had feared this, had imagined this scene 100 times, but the reality was infinitely worse. He saw himself through her eyes, a careless, cruel aristocrat playing games with the lives of his lessers. He had started this deception as a means of self-preservation, a way to find a sliver of authenticity in his gilded prison. He had wanted to find someone who would not be blinded by his title, and in his arrogance, he had blinded her instead. He had found something true and real with her, a connection that had begun to heal the deepest of his war wounds, and he had destroyed it with the very lie he had used to create it. Lucian Blackthorn's threats were a distant noise compared to the storm of self-loathing that now consumed him. He had two choices. He could bow to Lucian Blackthorn's blackmail, cast Elowin aside, marry Lady Evangeline Ashworth, and resume his life as the silent, dutiful prince, his heart once more encased in ice. Or he could fight. He could fight for the kingdom against a viper like Lucian Blackthorn, and he could fight for the woman who had shown him what it felt like to be a man again. The choice was no choice at all. He would not lose her. He would not lose himself again. He went to his study, not the simple room of Finn, but the prince's office, and began to write, his pen scratching furiously across parchment. He was done hiding. The Winter Prince was returning to his court, and this time he was bringing a storm with him. The journey back to the capital was a torment of proximity and distance. Elowin and Leander shared the same carriage, the same oppressive silence, but a vast, unbridgeable gulf now lay between them. She refused to look at him, keeping her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, her expression a mask of cold indifference. She had packed her few belongings, ready to return to St. Marguerite's the moment they arrived. She would not stay a second longer than necessary. She would disappear from his life, and he could have his title, his palace, and his noble bride. Leander tried to speak to her, his voice low and earnest, but she cut him off. "Do not speak to me, Your Highness. I am merely cargo you are transporting, a problem to be disposed of." He fell silent. the pain in his eyes so profound it almost broke her resolve. But she held firm, nursing her wounded pride like a shield. When they arrived at the imperial palace, the sheer scale of its opulence was a physical blow. It was a world of impossible grandeur, designed to make people like her feel small and insignificant. Servants in livery scurried past, their eyes averted. Nobles in silks and velvets stared at her simple wool dress with open curiosity and disdain. She was a stray cat brought into a lion's den, and she felt the predatory gaze of every courtier upon her. Leander led her through a labyrinth of marble corridors to a suite of rooms that were larger than the entire orphanage. Gilded furniture, silk hangings, and crystal decanters filled the space. A beautiful gown of deep emerald silk was laid out on the bed. "This is for the ball tonight," he said quietly. "You must attend." "It is the only way." Elowin looked at the dress with disgust. "So now I am to be your puppet? Dressed up and put on display before you cast me aside? No. I am not casting you aside," he said, his voice raw with an intensity that startled her. "I am fighting for you. For us. Lucien Blackthorn means to destroy me by using you. He will announce my engagement to Lady Evangeline Ashworth tonight, and he will present you as a momentary, foolish dalliance. I will not allow that. I need you to stand with me." "Stand with you?" she asked, a bitter laugh escaping her. "Why should I? You lied to me. You used me." "I did," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "And it was the worst mistake of my life. I was hiding, Elowin, not just from my duties, but from myself. You were the first person to see through the armor, the man you met at Thornfield, the man who read poetry with you and walked in the garden. That was the real me, more real than the prince they expect me to be. Please, trust me one last time." He looked at her, his princely authority gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading vulnerability. It was the same vulnerability she had seen in the man thrashing in his nightmare-ridden bed. Against her better judgment, a tiny, treacherous seed of hope began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. The grand ballroom of the royal palace was a dizzying assault on the senses. 1,000 candles burned in massive crystal chandeliers, casting a brilliant, glittering light over a sea of swirling silks, sparkling jewels, and powdered wigs. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and wine, and the sound of the orchestra was nearly drowned out by the ceaseless chatter and brittle laughter of the kingdom's elite. When Leander entered with Elowin on his arm, a wave of whispers followed them like the rustle of dry leaves. He was no longer Finn. He was every inch the crown prince, dressed in a severe black and silver uniform that emphasized his height and the military bearing he usually kept hidden. He looked cold, formidable, and untouchable. Elowin, in her emerald gown, felt like an imposter. The fabric was finer than anything she had ever touched, but she felt more exposed than if she had been naked. Every eye was on her, judging her, dissecting her. She saw Lady Evangeline Ashworth holding court in the center of the room, a diamond and sapphire confection of a woman, beautiful and flawless as a porcelain doll. She saw Lord Lucien Blackthorn standing near the king's throne, his smile thin and triumphant. He caught her eye and gave a small, condescending nod, as if to a servant. The sight of him solidified her resolve. She would not be his pawn. She lifted her chin, straightened her back, and met the disdainful stares of the court with a quiet dignity they could not understand. The music stopped abruptly. The king, a weary-looking man with his son's dark eyes, rose from his throne. Lord Lucien Blackthorn stepped forward, his voice booming with false sincerity. "Your Majesty, esteemed members of the court, It is with great joy that we welcome the return of our beloved Prince Leander Ravencrest. A polite smattering of applause followed. His Highness has returned to us ready to embrace his sacred duty. And so, it is my profound honor to announce the formal betrothal of Crown Prince Leander Ravencrest to the jewel of our kingdom, the Lady Evangeline Ashworth of House Beaumont. The court erupted in enthusiastic applause. Lady Evangeline Ashworth blushed prettily and curtsied, her eyes shining with triumph. Lucian Blackthorn smiled, turning his cruel gaze on Leander, waiting for him to play his part. This was the moment of his victory. The prince would be trapped, his commoner wife humiliated and dismissed. Eowyn felt Leander's hand tighten on her arm. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Leander stepped forward, releasing Eowyn's arm. He did not look at Lady Evangeline Ashworth. He did not look at his father. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found Eowyn, and he held her gaze. "Lord Lucien Blackthorn is mistaken," he said, his voice clear and cold, ringing through the suddenly silent hall. "There will be no betrothal to Lady Evangeline Ashworth." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Lady Evangeline Ashworth's face went pale with shock and fury. The king looked utterly bewildered. "Lucian Blackthorn speaks of duty," Leander continued, his voice rising with a passion no one in that room had ever heard from him. "For years, I have done my duty. I bled for this kingdom on the battlefield while men like him grew rich and powerful in their soft chairs. I have held my tongue while they plotted and schemed. No more." He turned his fiery gaze on Lucian Blackthorn, who had lost his triumphant smirk. "You think to trap me? To use this good and honorable woman as a weapon against me? You are a fool." He walked over to Eowyn, taking her hand and drawing her to his side in the center of the room. "This is Eowyn Nightingale, and she is my wife. My true and only wife. We were married 2 months ago." The scandal was a bomb detonating in the heart of the court. The whispers exploded into a roar of shock and outrage. Lord Lucian Blackthorn recovered quickly, his face contorting with rage. "This is an outrage, a disgrace. He has married a commoner, an orphan of no name and no standing. She is unworthy to even stand in this hall, let alone be our future queen. He has dishonored his blood, his family, and his kingdom." But before Leander could respond, Eowyn stepped forward. All eyes turned to her. She was supposed to be cowed, humiliated, a pathetic creature swept up in events far beyond her. Instead, she stood tall, her voice, though not loud, carrying a surprising weight of authority. "You speak of honor, Lord Lucian Blackthorn?" she asked, her gaze clear and direct. "Let us speak of honor. Is it honorable to use the king's resources to buy up grain from the northern territories, creating a false shortage, only to sell it back to the crown at an inflated price during a hard winter?" A stunned silence fell. Lucian Blackthorn's face went ashen. "Is it honorable?" she continued, her confidence growing, "to promise royal land grants to your cronies in exchange for their support in undermining the crown prince? I have seen your ledgers, my lord, the ones you keep at your country estate. The numbers tell a very interesting story, a story of treason." She had spent the afternoon in the palace library, not weeping, but reading. At Leander's urging, she had searched for any information on Lucian Blackthorn. She recalled a detail from the Thornfield accounts, large payments made to a shipping company owned by one of Lucian Blackthorn's cousins. On a hunch, she had cross-referenced them with Royal Treasury reports and found the discrepancy. It was a long shot, a half-formed accusation, but the look of pure, unadulterated panic on Lucian Blackthorn's face told her she had struck gold. Leander seized the moment. "Guards!" he commanded, his voice the voice of a king. "Arrest Lord Lucian Blackthorn. Seize his papers. He will stand trial for treason against the crown." The royal guards, who had only ever answered to the king, hesitated for a second, then looked at the prince. They saw not the sullen, silent boy who had left for war, but a commander, a leader. They moved without question, seizing a sputtering, protesting Lucian Blackthorn and dragging him from the hall. The court was in stunned disarray. Leander turned back to the crowd, his arms securely around Aloin's waist, presenting them as a united front. "My wife's nobility is not of birth or of blood," he declared, his voice resonating with absolute conviction. "It is a nobility of spirit, of intelligence, and of compassion. She has more honor in her heart than all of you combined. She is my choice. She is your future queen. If you cannot accept that, then you are no friend of mine or of this kingdom." He looked at his father, a silent challenge passing between them. The old king looked from his son's resolute face to Eloin's quiet strength, and for the first time in years, a slow, weary smile touched his lips. He gave a single, decisive nod. Away from the prying eyes of the court, in the quiet solitude of Leander's private chambers, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally faded, leaving them in an emotionally charged silence. The grand victory in the ballroom felt distant, less important than the unresolved chasm between them. Aloin stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit palace gardens, the emerald silk of the gown feeling like a costume she was desperate to shed. Leander came to stand beside her, the space between them humming with unspoken words. "What you did tonight," he began, his voice soft with awe. "You were magnificent." "I only spoke the truth," she replied, not looking at him. "It seems to be a rare commodity in this place." He reached out not to touch her, but as if to feel the warmth of her presence. "Eowyn, I know that my apology seems inadequate. Words cannot undo the lies I told, but I need you to know that the feelings I discovered, the feelings I have for you, were never false. You were my only truth in a life of deception." Finally, she turned to face him. The anger had gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, lingering hurt. "I fell in love with a man named Finn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A quiet, broken man who read poetry and needed someone to sit with him in the dark. I don't know this prince." "He is here," Leander insisted, and for the first time he let his own armor fall completely away. The pain he had so long concealed was now plain on his face, a raw and aching vulnerability. "He is the man I was before the war, before the crown crushed him. You found him again, Aloin. You brought him back to life. Don't let him go now." He took her hands in his grip gentle but firm. "I cannot erase the beginning of our story, but I am begging you to let me write the rest of it with you, with honesty and with all my heart. I love you, not as a prince loves a political necessity, but as a man loves the woman who is his very soul." Tears she had refused to shed now welled in her eyes and traced shimmering paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a fragile, burgeoning hope. She saw in his eyes not the Winter Prince, but her Finn, the man she had come to love in the silent halls of Thornfield. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of surrender and acceptance. "Then we will write it together," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, the capital buzzed with the story of the prince and his orphan bride. Lord Lucian Blackthorn's trial laid bare a web of corruption that implicated half the court, and Leander, with Eowyn's keen insights at his side, began the arduous process of cleaning his father's house. They did not do it with vengeance, but with a quiet, determined resolve to build something better. Lady Evangeline Ashworth was quietly married off to a minor baron in a distant province, her ambitions dashed. The court, seeing the unshakable bond between the prince and his wife and the quiet approval of the king, slowly began to shift from scorn to a grudging respect. Elowen was not the simpering, decorative princess they were used to. She was intelligent, she was compassionate, and she had a fierce devotion to the common people from which she had come. She became their advocate, their voice in the halls of power. One of their first acts together was to establish the Royal Foundation for the Children of the Realm, with St. Marguerite's as its first and primary beneficiary. Elowen herself oversaw the renovations, ensuring the children she loved would never again know the cold of poverty or the fear of homelessness. She and Leander worked as partners, his knowledge of the court and the law complementing her practical wisdom and deep empathy. They were forging a new kind of rule, one built not on bloodlines and ancient traditions, but on integrity and a shared vision for a more just kingdom. They decided to reaffirm their marriage, to have a ceremony that was not a legal contract born of desperation and deceit, but a true union of their hearts. They did not choose the grand cathedral or the palace ballroom. Instead, they returned to Thornfield Manor. The house was no longer a place of shadows and secrets, but a home filled with light and warmth. They stood in the wild garden, the same garden where she had first seen him, surrounded only by a handful of loyal friends. Mrs. Thornwick, whose stern face was softened by a rare, genuine smile. The solicitor who had first brought them together, looking thoroughly pleased with himself, and a delegation of the older children from St. Marguerite's, their faces scrubbed and shining. Elowen wore a simple dress of pale blue, and Leander wore the plain clothes of Finn. As they spoke their vows, looking only at each other, the weight of the crown and the court fell away. They were simply a man and a woman, promising to love, honor, and trust one another for all their days. It was a quiet, personal ceremony, a testament to the fact that their bond was theirs alone, not a performance for the world. A year later, Queen Elowen stood on the balcony of the royal palace, looking down at the cheering crowds gathered for the harvest festival. Beside her, Prince Leander Ravencrest, soon to be prince consort when his father stepped down, slipped his arm around her waist. The kingdom was changing. New schools were being built, fair wage laws had been passed for tenant farmers, and a new sense of hope was palpable in the air. The Winter Prince was a name spoken only in memory. Now they called him Leander the Just, and they loved his queen for her fierce compassion. Their life was a whirlwind of duties and responsibilities, but they always made time for the quiet moments that had forged their bond. They still read together in the library, their silent conversations across the pages now punctuated with soft laughter and shared glances. They walked in the gardens, his limp now barely noticeable, a faint reminder of a past he no longer allowed to define him. They had built a future that was more real and more fulfilling than either of them could have ever imagined. That evening, after the festivities had ended, Leander led Elowen to his private study, the one room in the palace that was his alone. On his desk lay a small, ornate iron key. He picked it up and placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "This was my father's, and his father's before him," he said softly. "It is the key to the royal archives, to the vaults, to every secret the crown possesses. But for me, it is a symbol of my last secret, my last wall. I have no more walls left, Elowen. My whole heart, my whole life is yours." She looked at the key, then up at him, her eyes shining with love. Tucked away in a small chest in her room was the untouched bag of gold, the dowry from their first false marriage. They had decided to use it to fund their next project, a recovery home for wounded soldiers, a place of healing for men like the one Leander had once been. The symbols of their past, the transactional gold, the locked door, had been transformed into tools for their shared future. Her journey had begun in desperation, a fractured life held together by duty. She had accepted a marriage to a silent outcast, an arrangement of convenience with a man she believed to be as broken and lost as she was. She had not known he was the crown prince in disguise, but in uncovering his secret, she had helped him uncover his own true self, and in doing so, had found her own strength, her own voice, and a love that would not only heal two lonely hearts, but would forever reshape a kingdom.